Apartheid in South Africa. And our final guest tonight is Dr. Margaret Lee, a professor of political science at Tennessee Tech in Cookeville. And let me welcome you to Black Pulse, Dr. Lee.
Thank you.
Dr. Lee, you are a scholar on the Southern African experience, and I understand that you've got a couple of books that are forthcoming dealing with that area of the African continent. And perhaps you would like to give us some information about the geography of Southern Africa.
Okay. Yes, I've been studying Southern Africa for about 14 years now, and it is a very interesting area to look at. When we talk about Southern Africa, specifically we're talking about 9 independent nations that consist of Angola, Botswana, Malawi, Swaziland, Mozambique, Tanzania.
And so South Africa is only one of several countries that
the 9 independent nations. Then we talk about South Africa, which is a country ruled by a white minority racist regime, and Namibia, which is a territory that South Africa occupies illegally. So those countries together make up the region of Southern Africa, and it's very important to make the distinction between South Africa as a country and the region of Southern Africa.
Well, we've said quite a bit about oppression during the first part of this program, especially when we made our introduction. And perhaps you would like to give us something about oppression in South Africa within some kind of historical context, since you've studied that area over the last 14 or 15 years.
Yes, when you talk about South Africa and apartheid, basically you can talk about apartheid having really started in 1652. As Mr. Turner indicated, in 1652 the Dutch first arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, and at that point they began to try to take over the country of South Africa, particularly in the region of the Cape. There's one point that I would like to correct, though, however, and that is that when the Dutch arrived, there were indigenous inhabitants at the Cape. In fact, they were known as the Khoi and the San. In fact, if you go back to ancient history in Southern Africa, it's said that people inhabited the area possibly as far ago as 70 to 80,000 BC. When the Dutch arrived, immediately the indigenous African population began to fight against the Dutch for possession over the land. By the early 1900s, however, through wars of land dispossession, the Dutch and later the British, who came into South Africa, had basically taken control over the entire country of South Africa and basically left the indigenous African population enslaved. As the years went on, culminating in the year 1948 with the formal introduction of apartheid, basically the whites in South Africa determined that they would establish a legal system that would separate the races forever. In
other words, the system had already existed, but it was made legal in 1948 into a system that we call apartheid at this point. Now, what do you see, given some of the things that we've said about the system, what do you see as the ultimate solution to this whole question of apartheid in South Africa? I say that within this context, that the overwhelming majority of Americans seem to oppose the system, but there is quite a number of people, perhaps 15% of our population, who believe that somehow the South Africans ought to be able to operate their own affairs and etc. And so within that context, why don't you use the remaining part of this program to give us what you might consider to be the ultimate solution to that question.
Okay. First of all, let me just make a statement as to the nature of apartheid in South Africa. When you talk about apartheid in South Africa, you're basically talking about Nazism. And since Nazism could not be reformed, apartheid cannot be reformed. I mean, it is the most oppressive system of government that exists in the world today, and it must be eliminated. The problem that exists today, of course, is how will this system be eliminated? We've seen through years of struggle Africans maintaining massive protests against the white racist regime. Clearly, the military might of the white minority rule government is so strong that it appears to be impossible for the indigenous African population to compete with that. then the strength exists because of the United States support for South Africa militarily, economically, as well as Israel support, West Germany support, France support, etc. What we see now that's taking place in South Africa really is an attempt to bring about a negotiated settlement in South Africa, which is very unfortunate. Because when we talk about a negotiated settlement in South Africa, what we are seeing is the possibility of a repetition of what took place in what was Zimbabwe and what was Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe. Specifically, the Africans were basically forced to compromise with the whites who had maintained a system comparable to apartheid in Zimbabwe. And out of that compromise, they basically maintained their same lifestyle that they had maintained while they were oppressing blacks and basically perpetuating genocide against blacks. And they still today maintain control over the economic structure of Zimbabwe.
So the Zimbabwe solution wouldn't be an appropriate solution, you don't believe, for what is going on in South Africa right now?
No, not at all, because...
No, what would be an appropriate solution, Doctor, over the last minute or so that we've got?
Well, of course, the appropriate solution would be for total liberation, where the African majority is in control of both the political and economic structures in South Africa.
Now, how do we bring that about? How could that be brought about?
I'm not certain today that that's going to be possible given the interest that the West has in maintaining economic control over South Africa. But the real key to liberation in South Africa, of course, has to do with the land being returned back to its rightful owners.
Very good, and I think on that note we'll have to end this program. And let me thank you and other participants for coming by and talking about this very, very important issue with us today. And let me invite you next week to tune in to another informative edition of the Black Pulse of Nashville.
Tonight at midnight, don't miss the fun of what's happening.